Welcome to Grateful, where we provide online SAT and ACT instruction to students all around the world. If you're interested in finding out more about how we can help you prepare for your next SAT or ACT, feel free to reach out. Right now, we're looking at the October 2020 SAT reading section, and we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. When you approach an SAT reading passage, you want to start by giving the passage a quick 60-second first read. In order to do that, we recommend that you skip as many words as you can. Long names, dates, things in parentheses, anything that slows you down, because what you need in the beginning is the overall main idea. In addition, there are going to be some questions that require being an expert on the passage, but what we're going to do is we're going to use the easier questions as an opportunity to get to know the passage better. Now that's a little tough to model in this video here because we're going to go in order through the questions, but when you're doing an SAT on your own, you first want to handle what we call the easy questions. Those are the questions that tell you what line numbers to look at. That includes evidence-based questions if the range is short. So implied in all of this is that you should always know when a question is followed by an evidence-based question. And if you're only being asked to look at, let's say, a maximum of 30 lines of the passage, then that's a little on the easy side, and you can just look through for the quote that pertains to that situation. So in general, you're first answering questions that give you the line numbers of where to look. Next, you're answering what we refer to as the medium questions, and those are the ones that don't necessarily give you a line number, but they give you something really clear to look for. So for instance, what did the narrator think about shopping centers? It's pretty easy to just look through a passage looking for where shopping centers were mentioned. And last but not least, we want you answering the harder questions, and those are the ones that require a deep expertise on the passage. And the idea is that in answering all the easies and mediums, you've little by little given yourself a natural period of time to go ahead and start answering those harder questions. So while we're not necessarily going to model the idea of going out of order in this video, we are going to go ahead and do the first read out loud. And if you've been following our videos, you'll notice that we've modeled a few different reading styles. And so it's an organic thing. There might be a moment where you're more in the mood to use one style for your initial read of the passage, and maybe you want to change it up, or maybe depending on the different types of passages that you're getting, one may be more appropriate for one style, or maybe something really difficult would be an appropriate passage for using the idea of focusing on verbs. But here, we're just going to loosely skip words as we read. When we're doing this, what we're doing is we're realizing that there's sort of an auditory and a visual part of our brain. The visual part of your brain moves super fast and can make totally quick decisions. And so that part of your brain is scanning ahead, looking to see what's most important. Now, the auditory part of your brain, that's the part where it sounds in your head like you're reading the passage out loud, and that one is a lot slower. So you only want to let your inner monologue pronounce the words when they're words that your mind has already deemed are important. So it's something that happens automatically, and what we encourage is for you to just kind of let that happen. So I'm going to go ahead and model that. Write what you know, the professor advised as he sent us off. That night after dinner, I sat there looking at it and trying to describe it to myself in a writerly fashion. The best I could come up with was a roof of mashed potato, blah, blah, blah. I climbed up to the library. On the shelves were ancient volumes. I wondered if anyone would ever open any of these books again, or whether they'd remain shut for eternity. Should I be the one to open them, to plant kisses on their pages and break the spell? Did it make sense to try and write? What if no one ever read what I wrote? I sat down, looking around. I listened to the distant scrapes of chair legs. For a while, I stayed there and tried to imagine what it was I actually knew. I'd seen almost nothing of the world. I had a trip to Rome and Florence. The level of my experience had remained the same. It hadn't risen, hadn't overflowed. I stood with other Americans huddled together. I thought now about how I had never been in love, had never gone to a political meeting in someone's basement, had never done anything that could be considered independent or insightful or daring. At Smith, girls surrounded me, the equivalent of those American tourists. Girls in groups were as safe as shepherd's pie. Now I sat in the library, freezing cold, and finally made myself begin to write something. I wrote about this impenetrable wall of femaleness that formed my life. I wrote about 3 perfumes. When I was done, I sat for a long time thinking of Professor Castleman and how he looked in class with his eyes closed. His eyelids had a purplish, nearly translucent quality. Maybe that was what it was like to be a writer. Even with the eyes closed, you could see. During his office hours, I waited with anticipation. Someone was already in there. I could hear the murmurs of a male and female voice with a shriek of hilarity, and this increased my annoyance. Was there a party going on? Finally, the door opened, and this person emerged holding her tedious story. From within the office, I could see Castleman. "Well, hello there, Miss Ames," he said, finally realizing I was there. "Hello, Professor Castleman," I said. He held my new story in his hand. "So, your story." There were almost no markings on it. "I read this twice," he said, "and frankly, both times I found it to be wonderful." So it's a person kind of discovering how to become the writer that she wants to be, and in the end, her professor actually likes her essay. So question number 1 is asking us to summarize the passage, and based on the idea of writing what you know, the professor told the narrator, "Write what you know," and that caused her to think about how while she was a tourist in Rome and Florence, she didn't really have any true experiences because she was sheltered by other tourists. And then she thought about the girls in her college at Smith, and girls surrounded her, so she was equally isolated. And then when she finally sat down to try to write, she wrote about the femaleness, the wall of femaleness that formed her life, which included perfumes and the sound of girl voices rising up to sing something together. So she's writing about the things that she actually knows, and then at the end, the professor liked her essay. So all of this amounts to answer choice C for number 1. A writer succeeds in conveying her experience in an authentic way. Question 2 is asking us to interpret what it means when the writer attempts to think in a writerly fashion in line 8. So that's right over here. And the clues we're seeing around there are the best I could come up with, which has a lot of tone to it. If you say to someone, "Is that the best you could come up with?" you're kind of finding a nice way to insult them. And next we see the word pathetically. So it's saying the best I could come up with was pathetically. And then there's a little phrase she came up with there. And actually, before all of that, we saw I sat there looking at it. And sitting there has some tone to it as well. I just sat there. Like, just imagine if you ask one of your friends, "Are you just sitting there?" It's got a negative tone to it. So we're seeing at least 3 things here that have a negative tone. And the biggest one out of all of those is the word pathetic. So pitifully inadequate is definitely in line with saying the best I could come up with pathetically was. So the answer for number 2 is B. Question number 3 is asking us about risks that writers face and which one is the narrator concerned about. And that's a reference to these lines here. What if no one ever read what I wrote? What if it languished untouched on the chilled shelf of a college library forever? So that's the idea of wondering, what if I go through all this work and I'm doing it for nothing? So it's kind of the narrator still being negative before she's really discovered that she is able to write in an authentic way. And that's the answer B for number 3, being overlooked by readers. And now we're going to question number 4, which asks for the effect of the words ignored, distant, and lone. So let's just go ahead and highlight those words here. Ignored, distant, and lone. So the whole sentence says, I sat down at a corral, looking around at the ignored spines of books, the light bulbs suspended in their little cages, and I listened to the distant scrapes of chair legs and the rumble of a lone book cart being rolled along one of the levels of the stacks. So this is the place where the narrator was doubting herself. She was saying, what if no one ever read what I wrote? What if it languished untouched on a chilled shelf of a college library forever? And she follows that with a description that has these really depressing words. Her words are ignored, and there are these distant scrapes of chairs in the library, and there's just a lone book cart being rolled along. So these are pretty depressing words. And so that's what we're kind of looking for, is something that captures the depressing tone being given around that area there. And these clues all seem to point toward A, because isolation is quite a depressing thing, kind of along the lines of what we've been reading here. Now let's take a second to talk about why some of the wrong answers are wrong here. Hostility is a very strong word, and we'd need to see specific evidence of that. Her lifelong desire to become a writer, well, that's a positive thing. So if that were the answer, we would see something more positive, like I want this and I love that, rather than I don't want this or this is being ignored. So this has more of a positive tone as opposed to the negative tone that we're seeing in the passage itself at that moment. And looking at D, they're undercutting her claims about the quality of her writing. Well, believe it or not, there was no talk in this paragraph about the quality of her writing. Although in common sense, in the real world, if no one reads your writing, then perhaps the quality is low. There is actually a semantic difference between quality and whether or not people read. And that's what you want to train on the SAT reading, is that attention to detail, the difference between having low quality and being unread. Although, like I said, in the real world, they can kind of tend to go together. Here, we keep them as separate things unless we're told otherwise. So we've discussed what's wrong with B, C, and D, and the answer for 4 is A. Question number 5 is asking for the meaning of the word pinned in context on line 33. And for passage-based vocabulary questions, first we want to get the context, and then we want to invent our own word to replace the given word. And the context was that the narrator was talking about how although she had traveled, she hadn't really had real authentic experiences. So we're hearing about the Americans that were all huddled together with their heads back and mouths dropped open, peering up at painted ceilings, and how she'd seen almost nothing of the world. She spent that trip in the protection of good hotels and behind glass windows of tour buses looking at fountains from an unreal remove. So talking about how although she was there, she hadn't really experienced anything. So that's the context. So now inventing our own word, I might say she was protected behind the green glass windows of tour buses. So if we go with protected, which answer choice matches that? I might say confined. She was confined behind the green glass windows of tour buses. Now, by the way, on these questions, if you can't read it with that word that you've chosen in place, if it doesn't make 100% sense, then don't pick it. Because I've seen in my tutoring with different students, especially lately, students picking words that just don't fit when you read them in place. So for instance, let's just try on the word displayed. A trip to Rome and Florence with my parents when I was 15 had been spent in the protection of good hotels and displayed behind the green glass windows of tour buses. So the trip was displayed behind the windows. It just wouldn't make sense that way. So let's just make an effort to not pick anything that wouldn't make sense. Question number 6 is asking in what way the college classmates resemble the American tourists. And that's a reference to this sentence right here. At Smith, girls surrounded me, the equivalent of those American tourists. So what they're really asking you about here is whether you understood what you had read up to that point. And there was the story about the traveling, how she traveled without fully experiencing where she was. And the next sentence is really critical. I thought now about how I had never been in love, had never gone to a political meeting in someone's basement, had never really done anything that could be considered independent or particularly insightful or daring. So there is being spelled out the idea that the narrator is saying she had never had any real true experiences. And then at Smith, girls surrounded me, the equivalent of those American tourists. Now, what did the American tourists do? It says on line 37, I had stood with other Americans, all of us huddled together, heads back and mouths dropped open as we peered up at painted ceilings. So all of them were huddled together, and it was the idea of the isolation, the idea that although she was traveling in a different country, she really was isolated from the other people and the experiences in that country. So while the other American tourists were the wall that kept her isolated, girls at Smith were the wall that kept her isolated. Now it actually talks about that later when it talks about where she starts writing about what she knows. It says, I wrote about the impenetrable wall of femaleness that formed my life. So first it was the tourists providing a wall around her when she traveled. Then it was the girls at her school forming an impenetrable wall of femaleness that formed her life. So all of that isolation is described by answer choice B. They are sheltered from exposure to new types of experiences. And now we're going to question 7, which is asking about the same wall we were discussing for question 6. It's this sentence right here. I wrote about the impenetrable wall of femaleness that formed my life. And we've talked at length about that. The American tourist had formed a wall that isolated the narrator from the experiences of traveling, and similarly, the girls at Smith College surrounded the narrator, the equivalent of those American tourists, which means that they function to isolate her from having real experiences. And so that matches answer choice D, an inescapable constraint that encourages students' social conformity. Now, the conformity part I really didn't see as well as I would have liked to in the passage, but we can discuss a lot of things that make the wrong answers wrong here. So A talks about a boundary that insulates the narrator from criticism, and we don't see any sign of wanting to be or of being insulated from criticism. Answer choice B talks about a barrier that needs to be overcome in order to succeed, and once again, we're not seeing any wording about succeeding maybe in life. Maybe we're thinking about succeeding in writing, but when you say this is what you need in order to succeed, we're talking about being successful, getting a job, and so on. And the passage doesn't really go into a lot of detail about that. And C talks about an ominous presence that alerts writers to consequences of failure. An omen is like a sign of things to come, like a warning sign or something like that. So we're just not seeing any kind of warning sign anywhere in here. So once again, the answer for 7 is D. And now we're going to question 8. Question 8 is our favorite kind of question because it tells us exactly where to look. And it's asking us about evidence that the narrator idealizes Professor Castleman. And what we were seeing was that his eyes had a purplish, nearly translucent quality, making them appear inadequate to the task of keeping the world out. Maybe that was what it was like to be a writer. Even with the eyes closed, you could see. So how do we know that the narrator is idealizing Professor Castleman here? Because she's taken a detail that really has nothing to do with writing, that his eyelids, which it says from the previous page, had a purplish, translucent quality, which made them inadequate to the task of keeping the world out. So she's really overanalyzing him and saying that even his eyelids are the eyelids of a writer. Maybe that was what it was like to be a writer, to have these translucent eyelids. So she's making connections between things that are really not connected, and that's a sign that she's idealizing him. So the answer for 8 is going to be A. Question 9 is an evidence-based question, and as we said, you want to always know when a question is followed by evidence. So when we start question 9, we're going to know that we only need to look at lines 66 to 82. Now that doesn't mean we're going to go straight through each of these quotes, because those quotes are meaningless without the areas that surround them. But we are going to read through 66 to 82, knowing that the right answer has to be somewhere in this area. So why does the narrator feel indignant? We read, someone was already in the office. I could hear the murmurs of a male and a female voice, punctuated by a shriek of hilarity, all of which increased my annoyance. So far, what is increasing the annoyance? The female hilarity and the male and female voice. Narrator continues, was there a party going on? Were drinks being served and damp little sandwiches? So that's kind of criticism of the idea that they're having too much fun for what should be an academic meeting. And finally, Abigail Brenner emerges, holding her tedious story about her grandmother's recent death from double pneumonia. So it's a little insensitive because it's calling the grandmother's death a tedious story. But tedious is the idea of being overly detailed and making a big deal about little things that shouldn't be a big deal. So they're having a great time while talking about what is being described as a terrible essay. So what does that match for number 9? That's C, the apparent frivolity of the meeting going on inside. So they're laughing, it sounds like they're partying, and then she comes out with this tedious, dumb essay, which is the way it's being described. And what answer would that be? A couple of the answer choices for number 10 look good to me here, but the best one is going to be B, 68 to 71, because that's the one that specifically says, all of these things increased my annoyance. And that's what the question was originally asking us. Why does the narrator feel indignant? In other words, why was the narrator annoyed? And it says right here, this is what increased my annoyance. So the answer for 9 is C, and the answer for 10 is B. So before we get into the next passage, let's go ahead and do our quick first read. Now, by the way, you always want to read this portion. It's not always going to have critical information, but when it does have information, that information is particularly critical. So it's adopted from a speech in 1860 by John Hossack, convicted of a violation of the fugitive slave law, and he was tried for aiding an escaped African slave in violation of the fugitive slave law in 1850. So let's go ahead and start reading. I'm a foreigner. I was born in Scotland, where a slave never breathed. Let a slave set foot on that shore, his chains fall off forever. He becomes what God made him, a man. In this far-off land, I heard of your free institutions, your prairie lands, your canals, and your towns. 22 years ago, I landed in this city. I opened a prairie farm. I am, sir, one of the pioneers of Illinois, who have gone through many of the hardships of a settlement of a new country. I have spent upon it my best days. No living man has greater interest in its welfare, and because I'm opposed to carrying out wicked and ungodly laws and love freedom, I stand before you today. I ought not be sentenced because I'm an abolitionist. I have no apologies to make for being an abolitionist. When I came to this country, I was a Democrat. There was a charm in the name, but I soon found I had to go beyond the name in order to know anything of its principles or practice. I found that however much the parties differed, in one thing they agreed, in trying which could stoop the lowest to gain the favor of the most cursed system of slavery that ever swayed an iron rod over any nation. As a man who fled from a crushing aristocracy in my native land, how could I support a worse aristocracy? I was compelled to give my humble name and influence to a party who proposed to embrace all classes of men. In this choice, I found myself in the company of these people in my native land, in this land of the free, and more than all else, the Redeemer, in whom I humbly trust for my acceptance with my God, who came to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captive, to set at liberty those who were bruised. Tell me, sir, can I be anything but an abolitionist? Surely for this I ought not to be sentenced. Again, I ought not be sentenced because the fugitive slave law, under which I'm torn from my family and businesses by the supple tools of slave power, is at variance with both the spirit and letter of the Constitution. I place myself upon the Constitution in the presence of a nation. Yes, in the presence of civilized man, I hold up the Constitution of my adopted country as clear from the blood of men and from tyranny. The parties who bend the Constitution, traitors not only to the liberty of millions of enslaved countrymen, but to the Constitution itself. A foreigner upon your soil, I go not to the platforms of contending parties, I go to the Constitution of my country. The word slave is not to be found. I read, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Yes, sir, to establish justice, to promote general welfare, to secure blessings of liberty. These were the men who had proclaimed to the world that all men were created equal, that they had certain inalienable rights. Can it be, sir, that these great men, under the cover of those hallowed words, intended to make a government that should outrage justice and trample upon liberty, as no other government under the whole heavens has ever done? So it's a really powerful essay that's kind of invoking the idea of liberty and equality and how fundamentally in conflict those ideas were with slavery at that time. And question 11 is asking about the primary purpose. So this is the kind of question that generally you would want to do after you've answered all the easy and medium questions. But the area where this is really being spelled out is starting on line 22. I ought not be sentenced because I am an abolitionist. I have no apologies to make for being an abolitionist. And it kind of explains the reason why. Because the person came to this country and was a Democrat and found that they were stooping to gain the favor of a cursed system. So it's kind of saying it's the other people that are committing crimes, not me. I'm living according to wonderful principles, and that's why I ought not be sentenced. And that all matches answer choice D for number 11, which says that the actions in service of the abolitionist cause should not be considered crimes. Question 12 is asking for the description in lines 1 to 5. And so there it says, I'm a foreigner. I was born among the rugged but free hills of Scotland, a land, sir, that never was conquered, and where a slave never breathed. Let a slave set foot on that shore, and his chains fall off forever, and he becomes what God made him, a man. So Hasek is saying that in this place where I come from, there's no such thing as slavery, and in fact, the idea of slavery there is a ridiculous idea. That matches answer choice B, the values of his homeland. In other words, the idea that slavery is ridiculous over there, and they've shaped his love of freedom because the passage goes on to talk about how the narrator has this love of freedom. So those things are shaping the love of freedom just in terms of the positioning of where they are in the speech. So the answer for 12 is B. So question 13 is asking us to interpret lines 8 to 15. 22 years ago, I landed in this city. I then opened a prairie farm to get bread for my family, and I'm one of the men who have made Chicago what it is today, having shipped some of the first grain that was exported from this city. I am, sir, one of the pioneers of Illinois who have gone through many of the hardships of the settlement of a new country. So the narrator is saying that I am one of the people who helped to build up this town into what it is. And the narrator's kind of giving himself a little authority and credibility. He's not just anyone, he's almost one of the authors of Chicago and of Illinois. And that exactly matches answer choice A for number 13, to emphasize the extent of his contribution. And that exactly matches answer choice A, that his account is emphasizing the extent of his contribution to the United States. So question 14 is asking why Hasek originally identified with the Democratic Party. And the quote is, in line 25, when I came to this country, like the mass from beyond the sea, I was a Democrat. There was a charm in the name. And Hasek continues to say, soon I found that I had to go beyond the name in order to know anything of its principles or practice. So Hasek kind of admits that method of subscribing to the Democratic Party was not a good one because he hadn't really gone deep enough, because later he had to go beyond the name to understand even more deeply. And so this contrast matches answer choice B. The Democratic Party appealed to him for superficial reasons. Simply that there was a charm in the name. It just sounded good. Question 15 is asking for the meaning of the phrase swaying an iron rod. And we had just seen the description earlier of I was a Democrat, there was a charm in the name, but I had to go beyond the name of the party in order to know anything of its principles or practice. And so now Hasek is going beyond and finding out more deeper information. I soon found that however much the great parties of my country differed upon different questions, in one thing they agreed, in who could stoop the lowest to gain the favor of a cursed system of slavery, the most cursed system of slavery that ever swayed an iron rod over any nation. So there's a very big contrast being painted there between, in purple here, the really superficial charm of, oh, Democrat sounds good, and what Hasek later found out, which was that this was something that was participating in a cursed system of slavery, the most cursed system of slavery that ever swayed an iron rod. And so there's a big contrast there between the lightheartedness being described in purple and the serious terror being described in blue here. So that iron rod can be described as a political influence exerted by a powerful group, the people who were in charge of slavery, who were sentencing Hasek right now. And the whole point of the essay is that he's saying that this group should have sympathy on him because they should know better than anyone that their own rules are immoral. So the answer for 15 is B. So now going to question 16, which is asking, why did Hasek become an abolitionist? And that appears to be a reference to this quote starting on line 35. As a man who had fled from the crushing aristocracy of my native land, how could I support a worse aristocracy in this land? I was compelled to give my humble name and influence to a party who proposed at least to embrace in its sympathies all classes of men from all quarters of the globe. In this choice, I found myself in the company of Clarkson and Wilberforce in my native land, and of Washington and Franklin in this boasted land of the free, and more than all of these, the Redeemer in whom I humbly trust for acceptance with my God, who came to heal the brokenhearted, and so on. So the narrator, Hasek, is basically saying, I already had these beliefs of freedom and equality, and these beliefs are in line with Clarkson and Wilberforce in my native land, Washington and Franklin in this boasted land of the free, and God himself. So the narrator is saying, I have certain basic fundamental beliefs, and my opinion regarding slavery has to be in line with those beliefs. So that's answer choice D. Slavery was another form of an unjust social system that he already opposed. And maybe even bigger than that was just the beginning of this quote in blue here. As a man who had fled from a crushing aristocracy, how could I support a worse aristocracy in this land? So it's kind of saying he already had certain opinions before he ever found out about American slavery. So question 17 is passage-based vocabulary, asking us about the definition of the word profess on line 58. And for these questions, we need to get the context and then invent our own word. So the context around line 58, the narrator says, I place myself upon the Constitution in the presence of a nation who have the Declaration of Independence read to them every 4th of July and profess to believe it. So there's the statement that we are a country that has stated in the Constitution these beliefs in liberty and the Declaration of Independence, and that we read this every 4th of July and we profess to believe it. So we have these amazing ideals that we live under, and we claim to believe those ideals. So we got the context, and notice that in getting the context, you can kind of invent your own word, maybe even without realizing it. They claim to believe it. And that exactly matches answer choice A. And you will notice that when you invent the answer in your own words first, trying your hardest not to look at the answer choices, occasionally you'll end up picking the exact same word as the correct answer choice. Question 18 is our favorite question type because it's telling us exactly what we should be looking for. We're looking for the idea that those who willfully distort the core principles of the United States should be considered criminals. So is that what they're saying in 55 to 58? Sir, I place myself upon the Constitution in the presence of a nation who have the Declaration of Independence read to them every 4th of July and profess to believe it. So maybe that could be implied to mean what question 18 is asking, but it's not literally saying it. Going to the next quote, 58 to 62, yes, in the presence of civilized man, I hold up the Constitution of my adopted country as clear from the blood of men and from a tyranny that would make crowned heads blush. So answer choice B is better than A because it's saying that these men are participating in a tyranny. So it's getting closer and closer. If there weren't a better choice, I would pick B for number 18. So answer choice C gets even better. Line 62 to 66. The parties who bend the Constitution to the support of slavery are traitors. Traitors not only to the liberties of millions of enslaved countrymen, but traitors to the Constitution itself, which they have sworn to support. So now we're getting somewhere because the word traitor is really, really strong. Traitors are people who are usually executed as a punishment for their crimes. And it says that they've sworn to support that Constitution. And so they've even agreed that they should suffer consequences if they don't support the Constitution. So C is going to be absolutely perfect. And just to be a little diligent, we'll go ahead and look at the last quote, 68 to 69, which says, I go, sir, to the Constitution of my country, the word slave is not to be found. So slavery is not found in the Constitution, but there's nothing about considering anyone criminals. So the answer for 18 is C. So question 19 is followed by an evidence-based question, so you always want to be aware when your question is followed by evidence. So when we start 19, we know that we only need to read around lines 66 to 84, looking for anything about how Hasek regards the authors of the founding documents of the United States. So let's go ahead and read that area. a foreigner upon your soil. I go not to the platforms of contending parties to find the truth. I go to the Constitution of my country. The word slave is not to be found. And we're looking, by the way, for the authors of the Constitution. I read, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. Yes, sir, to establish justice, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, and so ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. So far, we're seeing specifics about the Constitution, but not about the writers of the Constitution. So in a way, we can discount everything we've read so far. Going on from there, these were the men who had proclaimed to the world that all men were created equal. So now we're getting into the men, the writers of the Constitution, so we're getting warmer. That they were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and contended even unto death for 7 long years. Can it be, sir, that these great men, under the cover of these hallowed words, intended to make a government that should outrage justice and trample upon liberty as no other government under the whole heavens has ever done? So we're seeing a lot of talk about these men. These were the men who proclaimed to the world these wonderful ideals. Can it be that these great men intended to make a government that should outrage justice and trample upon liberty? So it's just pointing out how ridiculous it would be that the men who went out of their way to teach certain idealistic principles to the world would be the same men who intended to carry out an injustice. And so it's a tough question because the area that we're going to use, which is this quote right here, is kind of a double negative. So these men intended for liberty and justice and equality and all those types of ideals to really be the case. And we know that that's true because in 80 to 84, it says, could it be that these men intended to carry out crimes? That would be impossible. So yeah, it's a little difficult because it's being said in such a roundabout way. So since it's impossible that these men intended to outrage justice and trample upon liberty, in effect it's saying that it's totally certain that these men intended to reflect the actual practice of these important ideals, that they weren't just saying it, that they really wanted it to be done. And that's going to be answer choice D, 80 to 84 for number 20. So these men intended to really carry out those ideals. That's C for number 19. And the quote is 80 to 84, which is D for question 20. So before we start question 21, we're going to do our fast first read of both passages. So we're starting with reading the intro, which we always want to do. Passage 1 is adapted from Cloud Seeding Not Effective at Producing Rain as Once Thought. Passage 2, Does Cloud Seeding Really Work? So they both seem to be in line. They both seem to be negative about the idea of cloud seeding. So starting passage 1, in many areas of the world, including California's Mojave Desert, rain is a precious and rare resource. To encourage rainfall, scientists use cloud seeding, which is designed to increase precipitation by dispersing chemicals into the clouds. But research now reveals that the common practice of cloud seeding with materials like silver and carbon dioxide may not be as effective as it is hoped. In the most comprehensive reassessment of the effects of cloud seeding over the past 50 years, these guys have dispelled the notion that cloud seeding is an effective mechanism. During the course of the study, these guys looked over 50 years of data with an emphasis on rainfall amounts. They used a comprehensive rainfall database and compared statistics from periods of seeding and non-seeding. By comparing statistics with seeding, we're able to show that the increments of rainfall happen by chance. For the first time, we were able to explain the increases in rainfall through changing weather patterns instead of cloud seeding. Most notable was a 6-year period of increased rainfall, originally thought to be from cloud seeding. Professor Alpert and everyone showed that this increase corresponded with a specific type of cyclone that's consistent with increased rainfall. They observed a similarly significant rain enhancement over the Judean Mountains, an area which was not the subject of seeding. So going over to passage 2 now. Last year marked the conclusion of a 6-year study that's been the most comprehensive and rigorous to date to investigate whether cloud seeding actually increases precipitation. Called the WWMPP, the study was run by a team of researchers. In the end, it wasn't able to provide a definitive answer, but the results do provide a body of evidence that cloud seeding is working under certain conditions. Earlier studies would inject silver iodide into the clouds, then compare precipitation gauges in areas inside and outside the seeding zone, but the studies weren't repeatable and they didn't include enough trials to guarantee that observed increases weren't due to chance. The challenge with measuring the effect of weather modification is that natural rain and snowfall variability is larger than the amount of precipitation augmented by seeding. Still, the researchers thought they could address the drawbacks of past studies. They designed their project to run for 6 winter seasons in the mountains of Wyoming. They conducted more than 150 tests, selecting clouds to seed and clouds to be their unseeded controls. Measurements from the high-resolution snow gauges indicated that seeding elevated snowfall, but this result was achieved only after researchers threw out some of the tests where silver iodide drifted into control clouds or where not enough seeding material was released, so the final results weren't statistically significant. Nevertheless, all the results provided evidence for a positive trend. The scientists also took advantage of new developments in remote sensing and atmospheric modeling. Remote sensing observations are valuable because radar can describe growth of snow in a cloud in a much more immediate way than snow gauges. Detailed remote sensing measurements of cloud dynamics are cheaper and more doable than randomized statistical experiments that measure increases in snow on the ground, Geertz says. So the first passage seems to be looking at an inventory of existing research, and the second passage seems to be discussing an actual experiment that took place. But they both seem to be supporting the idea that cloud seeding generally doesn't work. Now we're going to question 21, the word practice in line 8, which is right here. And for passage-based vocabulary questions, first you want the context and then you want to invent your own word. So the context is just the area as a whole. Research now reveals that the common practice of cloud seeding with materials such as silver oxide and frozen carbon dioxide may not be as effective as it had been hoped. So now let's invent our own word. The research reveals that the common activity, I might say activity on my own. I also might say method. And which of those answer choices can match that? The only close one is procedure, the common procedure of cloud seeding with materials such as this and that. So the answer for 21 is A. And question 22 is asking us to interpret lines 18 to 25, so let's go ahead and read those. During the course of his study, Professor Alpert and his colleagues looked over 50 years' worth of data on cloud seeding, with an emphasis on rainfall amounts in a target area over the Sea of Galilee in the north of Israel. The research team used a comprehensive rainfall database and compared statistics from periods of seeding and non-seeding, as well as amounts of precipitation in the adjacent non-seeded areas. So it's really just describing what their effort was. Their effort was to look over 50 years worth of data, and they were specific about what data it was. It was the target area over the Sea of Galilee in North Israel, and that it took advantage of a rainfall database and compared statistics from seeding and non-seeding. So in layman's terms, this is describing what they did in their analysis. And that's answer choice D. It described a methodology that led to a new understanding. Because after this, it's going to say, and here's what we got out of that, the new understanding. So the answer for 22 is D. So when we start question 23, we need to be looking ahead and knowing that it's followed by an evidence-based question, and we're only going to have to look at lines 1 through 37. Now that's a fairly big range, but it's much easier than having to look through the passage as a whole. So let's look through 1 through 37 to figure out what was an important reason for the conclusions reached by Alpert and his colleagues. So if we're talking about the conclusion, that gives us a nice heads up, because in the beginning, we're going to get kind of an intro to everything. And in this area here, we're seeing kind of also an intro to what they're going to tell us. They're going to tell us that research reveals that the practice of cloud seeding may not be as effective as had been hoped. Then, as we answered in a previous question, we got the methodology. Here's what they actually did. They looked at 50 years worth of data and they compared these statistics. So that's describing what they did. So just by summarizing the paragraphs, we can kind of zero in on the area where the real quote lies. Next, we're going to get a presentation of what they arrived at after doing all that work. There was a 6-year period of increased rainfall originally thought to be a product of successful cloud seeding. they showed that this increase corresponded with a specific type of cyclone that's consistent with increased rainfall over the mountainous regions. So there was something that was originally thought to be a product of cloud seeding, and it turned out that there was a cyclone that explained the increased rainfall. So the reason for their conclusions was that there was a presence of conditions that could reasonably account for the increase in rainfall. It wasn't the cloud seeding, it was the cyclone. And the quote for that is the blue quote on our page, 32 to 37. They originally thought it was cloud seeding. It turned out to be a cyclone. So the answer for 23 is A, and 24 is D. Question number 25 is one of our favorite questions because it tells us exactly where to look and exactly what to look for. So we're looking for the idea that the conclusions of whatever this is cannot be regarded with complete confidence. So is that what they're saying in 44 to 47? Let's take a look there. Called the Wyoming Weather Modification Pilot Project. The study was run by a team of researchers from government, academia, and private industry. So that one's just basically telling us what it is and just a little introduction to it. So we're not seeing anything about how it can't be regarded with complete confidence. So going on to 56 to 58, here we're seeing earlier studies would inject silver iodide into clouds, then compare precipitation gauges in areas inside and outside the seeding zone. So this is telling us what earlier studies used to do, and so far no reason for us to doubt this current study. And now we're going over to 75 to 79, which says, but this result was achieved only after the researchers threw out some of the tests where silver iodide drifted into control clouds or where not enough seeding material was released, so the final results weren't statistically significant. So right there it's telling us there was a problem with the study, and that's why we can't regard the study with complete confidence, and so the answer for 25 is C. Now on to question 26, which is asking for the meanings of run in 46 and 68. So here's the first one, and here's the second one. So the first one says, called the Wyoming Weather Modification Pilot Project, the study was run by a team of researchers. So there we're seeing the idea that it was maybe managed or supervised by a team of researchers. And now looking at the next quote, it says, the researchers designed their $14 million project to run for 6 winter seasons in the mountains of Wyoming. So there the word run is being used timing-wise. It's going to last all that time for 6 winter seasons in the mountains of Wyoming. So we have run being used as managed and last, and that closely matches answer choice C, because it's being managed by these researchers, so conducted by the researchers, and is going to continue for 6 winter seasons. I feel like A came close. It was supervised by the researchers, but it wasn't going to complete for 6 winter seasons. So whenever you have a word choice or even a passage-based vocab situation in the reading section in section 1, you want to just go ahead and put those words in the space and make sure they make sense when you read them, and you can avoid a lot of mistakes that way. Question 27 is asking about the meaning of the paragraph on lines 82 to 85. So that's this paragraph right here, and what that paragraph is basically doing is it's talking about the advantages that they gain from certain technology. The scientists also took advantage of new developments in remote sensing and atmospheric modeling to examine dynamics inside a small subset of seeded clouds. So there were some benefits being gained from certain technology. And that most closely matches answer choice A. I kind of have a personal problem with the word technique, because it sounds to me like they're talking about multiple techniques. We're seeing the remote sensing and atmospheric modeling, but none of the answer choices come close in my mind. It's not comparing the effectiveness, because that would be saying that one thing is more effective than something else. And here it was only talking about the positive of one, not the negative of another. C says, explore methods used to justify. So justify would be saying, you know, here's why it was okay for us to do this, kind of along the lines of someone else saying it wasn't okay to do it and you have to defend yourself. And D says that information was compromised. That would say that the study was ruined. If the study was compromised, that means that there was a fatal issue with it, which is not what they're talking about. So the answer for 27 is A. And now we're going to 28, which is asking for the relationship between the two passages. And we'll do 28 a little bit backwards. The answer here is going to be B. Each passage describes a research study about the same practice, but these studies yield different conclusions. So in passage 1, we saw a study being described about the practice of cloud seeding, and that was Professor Alpert's study right here. And what they did is they looked at 50 years worth of data on cloud seeding, and the result of that was the idea that we were able to show that increments of rainfall happen by chance instead of by cloud seeding. So the result here is that cloud seeding simply didn't work. Passage 2, on the other hand, is also talking about cloud seeding, which we see right here. There's a conclusion of a massive 6-year study, and they used a different study. This was an actual experiment, not an analysis of data over 50 years like passage 1. But more importantly, the result of this was that there were no results. It says right here, the final results were not statistically significant. So passage 1 says cloud seeding doesn't work. Passage 2 says what we did was inconclusive. So we have the same practice, cloud seeding, and we have different conclusions like we just described. And now we're going to question 29, and we discussed a lot of this when we were talking about question 28, the designs of the studies. So going back over passage 1, we were seeing that Professor Alpert and his colleagues looked over 50 years worth of data on cloud seeding. So they did an analysis of existing information. And looking over at passage 2 now, what we were seeing here was the Wyoming Weather Modification Project, pilot project. And what it did is it actually tested out the theory, because it says they conducted more than 150 tests, randomly selecting clouds to seed and clouds to be the unseeded controls. So we're seeing that cloud seeding was actually attempted in passage 2, whereas old data was just analyzed in passage 1. And this all points to answer choice D. The researchers in passage 1 analyzed a set of existing data, whereas the researchers in passage 2 conducted new experiments. Question 30 is asking us to compare the ways that the different authors are presenting the studies that they're talking about. Now, passage 1 says that this was the most comprehensive reassessment of the effects of cloud seeding over the past 50 years. So it's kind of giving a lot of credit to this study and really claiming that it does a lot, that it's really revolutionary in nature. Passage number 2 is really forthright about discussing the flaws in the way the research was done. We're seeing right here that the results they just talked about were achieved only after the researchers threw out some of the tests where silver iodide drifted into control clouds or where not enough seeding material was released. So the final results were not statistically significant. So they were essentially meaningless. So the WWMPP, which we're talking about right now, was less definitive in its approach. In other words, you can't look at this data and make any real conclusions. It's not definitive. So the answer for 30 is A. And now let's go ahead and do our fast first read of the next passage. It's adapted from the passage Contagious, Why Things Catch On. Although geography clearly matters in voting, few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters, but it does. Political scientists usually assume that voting is based on rational and stable preferences. If we care about the environment, we vote for candidates who promise to protect natural resources, and so on. But we weren't so sure. Most people in the United States are assigned to vote at a particular polling location. Polling locations are typically public buildings, but can also be churches, private office buildings, or other venues. Different locations contain different triggers. Churches are filled with religious imagery, and so on. Could voting in a school lead people to support educational funding? To test this idea, a bunch of people acquired data from each polling place in Arizona's 2000 election. We used the name and address of each polling location to determine if it was a church, school, or other type of building. 40% of the people were assigned to vote in churches, and so on. Then we examined whether people voted differently at different types of polling places. We focused on a certain ballot initiative. This initiative had been hotly debated with good arguments on both sides. If where people voted didn't matter, then the percent supporting the initiative should be the same at schools and other polling locations, but it wasn't. Polling locations had a dramatic impact on voting behavior, and the initiative passed. This difference persisted even after we controlled for things like regional differences and political preferences and demographics. A 10,000 vote difference may not seem like much, but it was more than enough to shift a close election. For instance, and they gave 2000 as an example, triggers matter. So the passage is supporting the idea that the place where you vote matters. Now, for people new to this approach to reading where we skip as much as we can the first time through, just remember, if you go more in-depth than this, then you're preparing for the 100 possible questions they can ask you, and they're only going to ask you 10 or so questions. The other thing is, if you're someone who likes to read with a lot of detail, I would ask you, have you ever had that experience where you read something and have no idea what you just read? And that's what happens when you try too hard in the beginning. Because if I don't realize that this is a passage that's loosely discussing the idea that location influences voting preferences, then what business do I have getting into more deep details than that? You want to kind of start with the stuff that's essential and then branch into the less essential information. So let's go ahead and start answering questions. Question 31, which statement best expresses the main idea of the passage? Now, if we're reading really generally in the beginning, we are reading for main idea, so there's a good chance we get the main idea. But if for whatever reason you don't feel like you have it at this point, it's really important to go ahead and do this question later, because you want to use the questions as an opportunity to get to know the passage better. So when I'm answering all the easy questions first, which are the ones that tell me where to look, and answering all the medium questions second, which are the ones that give me something solid to look for, in doing that, I've gotten to know the passage better. And if I didn't know the main idea yet, then I should know it after doing all that. So we're not doing the questions in the order that we would recommend for you to do them on a real SAT. On a real SAT, you want to be really comfortable going out of order. But let's go ahead and just answer the question, because we just mentioned after our fast first read that it was arguing based on an experiment that was conducted that location influences voting preferences. And that matches answer choice D. Voting decisions can be influenced by the surroundings in which voters cast their ballots. And now we're going to question 32, which asks about passage-based vocabulary. And for passage-based vocabulary questions, you want to first get the context, and then you want to invent your own word. So we need to know what was going on around line 3, where we see, although geography clearly matters in voting, the East Coast leans Democratic while the South skews Republican, few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. So now, getting into the word itself, few people would think that the specific venue in which they vote matters. So in my own words, I would use the word specific, the specific venue, and that matches answer choice A. And like I said earlier in this video, you want to go ahead and read it in place to make sure it works. Few people would think that the specific venue in which they vote matters. So the answer for 32 is A. Question 33. This one's asking about experts who hold the traditional view of voting behavior. And what would they say about the 2000 school funding initiative in the Arizona general election passing? So what would the traditional view say? The traditional view was laid out in the beginning of the passage. Although geography clearly matters in voting, the East Coast leans Democratic, the South skews Republican, few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters. Political scientists usually assume that voting is based on rational and stable preferences. People possess core beliefs and weigh costs and benefits when deciding how to vote. So that's the traditional view right there. It says people vote based on what they believe. And why would the initiative pass? Because people believe that the initiative accorded with their reasoned views. In other words, the initiative coincided with what people believed about education. That's the traditional view, but the passage was here to tell us that the polling location mattered more. Now 34 is asking us for a quote to support where that traditional view comes from. And a place that we can look for this might be 11 through 13. If we're concerned about healthcare, we support initiatives to make it more affordable and available to greater numbers of people. So that is just kind of an illustration of the idea that where you vote matters. If we care about this, then we're going to vote for that. And that supports the traditional view, not the view of the passage. And so the answer for 34 is B. Question 35 is asking how the author characterizes himself and his research team. And it's really referring to this statement right here. Few people would think that the exact venue in which they vote matters, but it does. And once again, a little later in the passage, we see, in this calculating cognitive model of voting behavior, the particular kind of building people happen to cast their ballot in shouldn't affect behavior, but we weren't so sure. So how were they characterized? As doubtful of the status quo, doubtful of the preeminent opinion among researchers. And that's answer choice C. They were unconvinced by certain assumptions about how voters make their decisions. Now we're going to our favorite type of question. Question 36 tells us where to look and what to look for. It gives us everything we need. So we're looking for the idea that voters felt deeply invested in the outcome of the vote on the school funding initiative. And the one that said that was answer choice B. It said, this initiative had been hotly debated with good arguments on both sides. So people were really emotionally invested in the outcome because they were hotly debating it and there were strong arguments, good arguments on both sides. So the answer for 36 is B. And now we're going to 37. That's passage-based vocabulary, where we want to get the context of that area in question, and then we want to invent our own word. So the context is around here. We saw if where people voted didn't matter, then the percent supporting the initiative should be the same at schools and other polling locations, but it wasn't. More than 10,000 more people voted in favor of the school funding initiative when the polling place was a school. Polling locations had a dramatic impact on voting behavior. So now, inventing in our own words, what kind of impact did they have? They had a dramatic impact. They had a strong impact on voting behavior. And that's answer choice C. They had a striking impact. Now we're going to question 38, which is asking us for the function of the last paragraph in the context of the passage as a whole. So the last paragraph says, a 10,000 vote difference may not seem like much, but it was more than enough to shift the election. In the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, that came down to less than 1,000 votes. If 1,000 votes is enough to shift an election, 10,000 certainly could. Triggers matter. So it's supporting the idea that a small difference is a big deal. And that matches answer choice A for 38. It's addressing a potential criticism of the author's argument by providing a context in which that criticism should be understood. So the potential criticism is that, 1,000 votes is not that big of a deal. But the context is that in this particular election, 1,000 votes made all the difference in the world. So the answer for 38 is A. So question 39 is asking us about the claim in the last sentence, and that claim is the idea that triggers matter. So what's a weakness of that claim? It's answer choice D. The author makes a general claim about the significance of triggers, but the passage provides evidence of only one instance of a trigger affecting voters' actions. So we were seeing about the 2000 presidential election, and earlier in the passage seemed like there was kind of another example in there, but if you look closely, it was once again the 2000 general election. So there was only one piece of evidence truly being discussed in the passage, and that's why the answer for 39 is D. Question 40 is asking about what's true about the voters who lived within 0.2 miles of a school and voted in a school. And this is kind of a tricky question with all these stats and careful wordings here. But for this group that they're talking about, whether it was initial or controlled for demographics, those are the voters who live within 0.2 miles and they voted in a school. And what are we seeing about them at a really basic level? They had a number here. So in other words, they had an increased percentage or likelihood of supporting the school funding initiative, and that's answer choice A. They supported the school funding initiative at a higher rate than those who did not vote in a school. And those people are not on the graph, but because there's an increase shown right here for the ones who were voting in a school, then that implies that the ones who did not vote in the school did not have the increase. Answer choice B is really tempting because the numbers 0.583 and 0.560 are so similar, but we lean away from that one because it's subjective whether that's a big difference or a small difference, and maybe in certain types of social sciences that's a giant difference, and in other types it's a tiny difference, so we don't want to make that judgment call, which is why A is better than B. 41 is asking us what the last row of columns B and C are doing. And those are the numbers that they got after they controlled for demographics. So what does it mean to control for demographics? It's taking into account different dynamics between the people who voted and controlling for those. So in other words, it's ruling out the possibility that the results can be explained by saying, oh, well, it was because everyone was Latino or because everyone had a certain income level. So controlling for demographics is exactly this idea, ruling out alternatives to the explanation of what they were talking about. So the answer for 41 is going to be B. And now we're starting on a new passage just before question 42. Let's go ahead and do our fast first read of the passage. This passage is adapted from Trophic Cascades on Islands 2010. In the 1970s, one of us visited more than 500 Bahamian islands to survey distributions of vertebrates, with special emphasis on lizards and birds. An objective was to determine the threshold on which vertebrate populations can survive. We were astonished to find lizards on some islands, a discovery that was multiplied by at least 2 orders of magnitude. We realized we had to check many quite small islands to determine such thresholds, and in the course of that endeavor we came upon a large number of islands without lizards. So they were surprised to find lizards, and then they found islands without lizards. This led to a second, even more exciting discovery. Such islands sometimes had high densities of spiders. In 1981, we had to investigate this phenomenon systematically for the many small islands in the central Bahamas. Our first study found that spiders were about an order of magnitude denser on no lizard than lizard islands. A second observational study examined spider species, finding that no lizard islands had 1.5 to 2 times the number of species as had lizard islands. This result was quite different from a famous result in the Rocky Intertidal, in which diversity increased with increasing predation. Such comparative data pointed to a strong negative effect of lizards on spiders, but as is true on all comparative studies, the observations did not suffice to eliminate alternative hypotheses. A more reliable investigation would be experimental, and toward that end we staked out 9 plots in 1985. 3 plots were unenclosed, and others had wood frame fences made of hardware cloth topped with smooth plastic to impede lizard locomotion in and out. 3 of the enclosed plots were randomly chosen to maintain lizards at natural densities. The other 3 had lizards removed. We had 3 treatments. The 2 types of enclosed plots tested the lizard effect, and the unenclosed plots were a cage control to be compared with the enclosed lizard plots. The 18-month experiment showed that lizard removal enclosures had spider densities 3 times higher than those control enclosures and the unenclosed plots. Numbers of spider species were higher without lizards as well, in parallel to the comparative studies. Numbers and biomasses of insects caught in sticky traps were also higher in lizard removal enclosures. Therefore, an increase in spiders did not completely compensate for the absence of lizards. There was some effect of the enclosure. Sticky traps in the enclosed plots caught about 20% fewer arthropod individuals than those in open plots. What was the mechanism of the lizard effect on spiders? The obvious one is predation. However, a second is competition for food. Spiders consume large prey in relation to their own size, so lizards and spiders might overlap in prey size well beyond their relative body sizes alone. So the point of everything is that you don't really need to feel like you fully understand what you read after that first read. We know that it's forming an opinion about the relationship between lizards and spiders in these islands, and testing out the idea of whether more lizards means less spiders or less lizards mean more spiders, and sort of going into like competing views on all of that. So let's start with question 42, nice straightforward vocabulary question for vocab questions. Number one, we want the context, and number two, we want to invent our own word to replace the given word. So the context there, we just need to read that general area. We were astonished to find lizards, particularly this type of lizard, on some tiny islands, a discovery that multiplied by at least 2 orders of magnitude the list of Bahamian islands surmised or known to have resident populations of vertebrates. We realized we had to check many quite small islands to determine such thresholds, and in the course of that endeavor we came upon a large number of islands without lizards. So now coming into the word, we realized we had to look at many quite small islands to determine such thresholds. So I would say look at. I would also say examine. So we got the context, we did a little reading, and we came up with our own words, which would either be look at or examine. And the answer that's closest to that is D, inspect. Question 43 is asking about the parenthetical statements in 25 to 27 and 30 to 33. So we have this one right here in blue, and this one right here in purple. And what do both of those seem to be saying? The blue one says that they adjusted for the positive and negative correlations with area and distance from large land masses respectively. And the purple one says we adjusted for area and distance and for maximum height attained by vegetation on the island, which correlated positively with the number of spider species. So they made these adjustments to kind of make sure that they weren't missing any factors in the way they were analyzing their numbers. And that closely matches answer choice B for 43. They were describing additional variables that they were going to adjust for. And that's a common thing that the SAT likes to ask about, these adjustments for different factors. So just kind of something to keep on your radar as you look at future questions and reading there. And as we go to question 44, we should always look ahead to the next question and know when we're followed by evidence. And indeed, this question is followed by evidence. So we're going to look at 44 and 45 as a pair. So 44 is asking us why the observational studies of the early 1980s were significant. And we know when we're answering that we only need to be looking around lines 19 to 38 to find out why those observational studies were so significant. And the question is helping us quite a bit by giving us such a narrow area of where to look. So we're going to read 19 to 38, looking for why were the observational studies significant. So in 1981, we had to investigate this phenomenon systematically for the many small islands in the central Bahamas near the relatively large island of Staniel Cay, a major stopover in our earlier study. Our first study found that spiders were about an order of magnitude denser on no lizard than lizard islands, adjusted for whatever. A second observational study in 1982 examined numbers of spider species, finding that no lizard islands had 1.5 to 2 times the number of species as had lizard islands, again adjusted for different things. This result was quite different from Payne's 1966 famous one in the Rocky Intertidal, in which diversity increased with increasing predation, and it presaged other such results for territorial arthropods in our system and in others also. Such comparative data pointed to a strong negative effect of lizards on spiders, but as is true of all comparative studies, the observations did not suffice to eliminate alternative hypotheses. So now, this is not in our range, but it's giving us a good window into the way the author is viewing that other study. Because there was the famous one, the famous study, in which diversity increased with increasing predation, and it presaged other such results for territorial arthropods in our systems and in others also. So we don't know what presaged means, and we're not supposed to know. But the point is that there was another study that kind of did the opposite of what their study did. So the first study found that the spiders were denser on no lizard islands. The second study found that no lizard islands had more spider species. So generally, more spiders when there's no lizards. This result was quite different from a famous study where the diversity increased with predation. So they're finding two opposite things. What they found is that more spiders means less lizards means more spiders, but it goes against another study which said that more spiders means more lizards means more spiders. So the big difference is that in the 1980s studies, they found one result, whereas in the 1966 study, they found something totally different. That matches answer choice C. The 1980s studies were inconsistent with the findings of an earlier investigation into a similar relationship. And the place that specifically said these results were so different was in line 34, where it says this result was quite different from the 1966 result. And that's lines 34 to 35, so we'll pick answer choice D for 45. As we look at question 46, we need to be always looking ahead to the next question to see if it's an evidence-based question, and indeed it is. So we need to answer questions 46 and 47 as a single item, looking at lines 39 to 56. And what we're looking for is the primary advantage the experimental study had over the observational study. So let's go ahead and read for that. Such comparative data pointed to a strong negative effect of lizards on spiders, but as is true of all comparative studies, the observations did not suffice to eliminate alternative hypotheses about why islands with and without lizards might differ. So what was wrong with the observational studies? They did not eliminate alternative hypotheses. Now, another way to say that is answer choice B. They did not control for factors that might have influenced the results of the researchers' observational studies. This is kind of getting at the heart of what you really have to do on SAT reading. You have to be okay with dramatic synonyms. Believe it or not, the purple statement and the green statement in answer choice B are kind of saying the same thing. Because if we're eliminating alternative hypotheses, we could also say that that's controlling for factors that influence the results of researchers' observational studies. So like in other words, we're limiting what other researchers might say and other ideas they may have. So controlling for other factors is kind of limiting other interpretations. And so it's kind of a big stretch there, but the answer for 46 is B, and we based it on lines 39 to 46, so the answer for 47 is A. Question 48 is our passage-based vocabulary question where we want to get the context and then invent our own words. So let's start reading around line 51. 3 of the plots were unenclosed and the others had wood frame fences made of hardware cloth topped with smooth plastic to impede lizard locomotion in and out. 3 of the enclosed plots were randomly chosen to maintain lizards at natural densities, whereas the other 3 had lizards removed. So what were they doing? They were kind of keeping the lizard levels at a certain density level. So in my own words, I might say controlling the level of the lizards. They were keeping the level of lizards controlled. And notice how I even, in my own words, without realizing it, said keep, because it's just such a perfect word to replace maintain in line 50. So we're controlling the level, we're keeping the lizards at the densities that they're at, and the answer for 48 is A. So 49 is a really tough question. Which of the following findings, if true, would support the explanation in 71 to 74? That explanation is a second mechanism of the lizard effect on spiders is competition for food. Spiders consume large prey in relation to their own size. So lizards and spiders might overlap in prey size well beyond their relative body sizes alone. So translating that into plain English, it's the idea that they compete over food. And that could possibly explain why, when there's more of one of those animals, there's less of the other. And that matches answer choice A here. The total insect biomass consumed by spiders was reduced in enclosures and unenclosed plots compared with the one consumed by spiders in lizard removal enclosures. So in other words, when the lizards were removed, the spiders were going to eat more because they didn't have competition. So A looks really good. And it's really the only answer choice that kind of says that, you know, when there's no competition, then whichever animal we're talking about got to eat more. You know, the other ones we're talking about their survival rate, which is how long they live, so it's unrelated. C was talking about how close to the ground were they found, so once again, irrelevant. And D is talking about the size of the insects that were eaten, which is kind of related, but we weren't really going too deep into the size. We were just talking about how they generally eat food of the same size, because the passage said that there was simply some overlap in their prey size. So we weren't really getting into more detail than just the fact that they have the same size. And so answer choice D is maybe too detailed. So like we said, 49 is A. Now question 50 is asking us about figure 1, and it's asking us about the overall mean population of spiders. And it's really easy to not see that right here it says the overall mean. And so we're looking for spiders, the mean number of spiders, in plots where the lizards were removed. And lizards being removed is this one right here. So it would have been this green line, but the overall mean is the little bit at the end. So it's this little green dot here. And that seems to be around between 75 and 100 on the y-axis. And so the answer for 50 is C. Now for question 51, it's also asking us about figure 1. And the information in the figure strongly suggests that. So what are we seeing in here? What's the overall trend? Well, I see that for the natural density of lizards and the unenclosed plots. So unenclosed means that other animals can kind of freely come in and out, so it's kind of close to the natural density. We see these two lines kind of being in this area for that. And for when the lizards were removed, I noticed two things. Number one, the mean number of spiders was generally higher. So if there's an answer choice that says there were generally more spiders, maybe we'll take it. And it also has a higher variability. It goes up and down more dramatically. So we're looking for the numbers to be higher overall, or for them to be more variable, for them to be changing more. And so the second thing we said was that when the lizards were removed, there was more variability, and D says the same thing. When the lizards were there was less variability in the number of spiders over time. So the answer for 51 is D. And question 52 is asking us about figure 2. And which of the following statements does figure 2 best support? Well, what is figure 2 is the percent composition of the lizard diets and spider diets. And looking at the lizards and the spiders eat all of these kinds of foods, and there are only two that they don't seem to be eating, the two that have numbers closer to 0. And for the lizards, they have all of these things. These are the different percentages of different types of foods in the lizard diets. And so a nice simple interpretation of this is answer choice C. The lizards were not dependent on any single food source. They had all of these different food sources for question 52. And so the answer there is C. And thank you so much for listening to our video on the October 2020 SAT reading section. Gradeful Test Prep provides online SAT and ACT instruction to students all around the world. Our students are increasing by a really big number for every hour tutored, and that number seems to be increasing as time goes on. So if you really want to get started on boosting your SAT or ACT score as soon as possible, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know that you're interested in some tutoring. And thanks again for listening to our video. Have a wonderful day.